And I just wanted to remind you, this is the last meeting of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture group for the year. Those of you who are new, we meet every Monday, and we will be doing this again next year. Feel free to meet here if you wish. We always circulate a sign-in sheet, so please do sign that so we can prove to the Dean that we're using this money wisely. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Office of the UCLA Dean of Social Sciences, who has been extremely generous this year. We're also co-sponsored by the Cookson Institute of Archaeology, the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and the Department of Com Studies. And I'd like to thank Rowan Hong, who has stepped in and introduce Avery Lopez, who will assume this role next year.
Hey.
And Dan Fessel will be taking over my role next year, so if you have suggestions for future speakers, please let him know about that. Today's speaker is Peter Gray. Wait. Yes.
We have to thank Susan for organizing a great year. It's been really stimulating.
And our last speaker is Peter Gray, who was an undergrad here and who graduated around the time the speaker series was founded. We're trying to work out the exact chronology, but around then. And his title for today is Sex, Babies, and Dogs, Evolutionary and Endocrine Aspects of Changing Human Families.
Well, thanks for having me. I just gave this talk last Wednesday at HBES as a plenary. That was the most stressful talk I think I've ever given. And it's nicer to see fewer people scowling at me in this audience. But nonetheless, and also just being back in a former home. This is pretty cool to be back here. So thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation. Here I am 25 years ago. Indeed, 25 years ago. I lived in Hitch Suites. There I am as a freshman with my suite mates. A couple of them were sufficiently well known that I asked for them to autograph their pictures. For those of you sports fans, you might recognize at least one of them who remains in the news for discussions about likenesses being used on video game covers and such. But these are also guys who took UCLA to its last NCAA basketball championship. So it goes back a few years. But as all that was happening 25 years ago, I was also taking my first anthropology class. I took Anthropology 7 with Dr. Larry Mai. I think he was a visiting instructor at the time. And at the time, I was a civil engineering major at UCLA. So I came here from Colorado Springs, out of state, naive but good at math, and I thought I'm going to enroll in civil engineering. And then I took this thing, Anthro 7, that some of you have taught here, or you've been teaching assistants for, and it was so much more wildly interesting, no offense to the folks that way, that I would switch majors my sophomore year and go on to major in anthropology and geography / environmental studies, and then the rest would all happen. But there I am again in my relative youth, and funny enough, I'm now here with one of my daughters who's with my father-in-law checking out LA while I'm doing this. My, how things change. As I joked with Susan, it seems there's a 7-year time frame to bringing me back in this very room. So in 1996, I defended my honors thesis. So Rob Boyd, Joe Manson, and then Nick Burton-Jones was my third reader on it. But this really rewinds the clock sometime. And then in 2003, I was a postdoc, having just finished grad school at Harvard. I was here in LA working with Shalander Basine, who's since left for Harvard Med School, on studies giving men testosterone or placebo. I don't know if any of you, Dan, if you remember this, I rubbed some fake gel on my shoulders in 2003. It was placebo gel. It was not Testim, to ask whether or not I'd become more aggressive in the course of my talk. I don't think I did. But anyway, that was in the spirit of a placebo-controlled study. I came back in 2010, and then here I am again in 2010. By the way, those are my daughters then. They are, again, older. And that was from the inside cover of the hardcover of our fatherhood book. They snuck into my author photo, appropriately enough, in a book on fatherhood. But at any rate, thank you for having me back, since we are at that 7-year cycle. What am I going to talk about today? I don't know that this is going to be mind-blowing. I'm going to try, but I can't guarantee. There's Stella, who's somewhere around here with my father-in-law. Anyone been there? This is outside of Flagstaff. This is really mind-blowing, you can tell. She did not listen to my talk today, but this is some other air phenomenon, hot air meets the cold air. You get some of these pressure systems here as well, I'm sure. But whether or not you find this mind-blowing, I nonetheless will cover a lot of ground the next hour. I'm going to talk about, yes, sex, babies, and dogs. So Dan, I mentioned your dogs would have been happy with some of the content. But I will also talk about changing human families in those respects in two ways. I'm going to talk about how human families differ from our close great ape kin, so chimps, gorillas, orangs, and so forth. And then the second aspect of changing families is, compared to human hunter-gatherers, how do human families vary around the world? How have they changed? So those are the two ways in which I'll talk about changing human families and the ways in which that entails discussions of hormones and life history. This will draw on not an exhaustive review, but rather my own sort of idiosyncratic review. In this hour, there's not enough time to do justice to everything, so you'll see me just sort of pick and choose from the literature, in part drawing upon my own research and publications and so forth. We may have footprints of our past to help guide our discoveries, our interpretations, and so forth. Many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the Laetoli footprints from northern Tanzania. More recent discoveries of footprints from what we think is probably Homo erectus from 1.5 million years ago suggest some behavioral interpretations. It's speculative. Could there have been multi-male groups? Could there have been group hunting with Homo erectus at this time? Who knows? But this is beautiful to actually have some footprints to try to reconstruct the past, including past family social behavior. More generally, how do we go about doing this if we don't have footprints literally in the mud? We can use everything possible. So comparative data, hence talking with Susan about capuchin monkeys, talk with those who study great apes, for example, general evolutionary and life history principles, human hunter-gatherer data, human families in broader context, basically bring all hands on deck, and I think Beck is an audience that gets that, to try to explain our families, how they become the way they are, and also how that may intertwine with some hormones and life history contexts. You may end up getting some cool reconstructions like these from the Smithsonian. In turn, you may ask, how do some of these robust Australopithecines, Homo floresiensis, Neanderthals, what were their families like? How long did the grandparents, if they lived at all to become grandparents, live? How involved were fathers? What roles did older siblings have in caring perhaps for younger siblings? Again, a speculative enterprise, but we'll draw upon the best evidence that we can to try to shed as much light, ultimately leading to the museum dioramas that you or your students may be visiting. A few take-home points from those efforts, again, just scratching the surface. Here you're looking at endocranial volumes, one measure of brain size over the last 3 million years in hominin evolution. And one thing is it increases over time. So there are some scenarios put forth by which human families emerged with Ardipithecus, basically with involved fathers, and things remain that way thereafter. That's at odds with some of the broader archaeological and fossil evidence in which you have instead a pattern of mosaic evolution. In other words, there are multiple grade shifts, early Homo, Homo heidelbergensis, modern humans, and so forth, rather than some overnight change that then remains somewhat similar for millions of years subsequently. And if any of you have been tracking the Homo naledi finds the last few weeks, that just further kind of blows your minds too, to ask about their family relationships, how they fit in, and so forth. Of course, we'll draw heavily upon hunter-gatherer data. Why? Because they live in ecologies more similar to those in which our ancestors live. Of course, their lives are changing. We know that. So Frank Marlowe was one of my PhD advisors. He and many others working with hunter-gatherers have long pointed out that that male subsistence technologies in today's foragers differ from those of ancestors. So you get more efficient hunting, for example, today than you would have 1 million years ago. You can ask about controlled use of fire too, and its time frame and so forth. But one thing you take away, and Brooke would like this, I think, in terms of the hunter-gatherer literature, is no human hunter-gatherer societies live with basically single moms. Instead, they live in arguably cooperative or communal breeding communities or families. You can debate the terms, but there's always someone else, grandmas, dads, older kin, playing a role in raising the next of generations. That's important, and that differs from, say, orangutans. So how do, again, human families compare with those of our ape kin? These are some of the traits that distinguish us. We tend to form long-term reproductive bonds, unlike chimps and bonobos, within which our offspring are born and raised. There are a variety of allo-maternal caregivers. We also tend to have higher fertility, attendant to shorter interbirth intervals, in part because of the resources females can get, but also because of resources they may garner from other contributors, and so forth. And something else we'll come back to, extended childhoods, and so forth. So I think most of you are familiar with thinking about this kind of stuff, but it's just to underscore that this is important in and of its own right, in addition to asking about how human families have come to vary as they've sort of shifted beyond a hunter-gatherer pattern. No, I'm not going to test you on the final exam in a week and a half on this, but this is just one person's attempt to synthesize the various phylogenetic and adaptive models of human long-term pair bonding. And I think if you draw upon the comparative evidence, for example, you'd suggest that mate guarding probably is the start to this, and then things like a sexual division of labor in which male resource flows are important is more recent and derived. So I think, in other words, you can link up both the phylogenetic and adaptive picture to this stuff. And others have said the same thing, but it's just to say there are some very reasoned arguments out there to how to see these things in evolutionary sequence too. Since we evolved as a species about 150 to 200,000 years ago in sub-Saharan Africa, we've wandered the globe. We've colonized the entire Earth. Some of us have left Earth. I don't know if any of you will, or maybe you have. A few monkeys and chimps have too, a few dogs as well. But we've covered the whole Earth, and in the course of doing this, we've also taken our cultural traditions and intersected with a variety of other ecological factors to give rise to tremendous variation in human families. So you can model that variation on cultural evolutionary or behavioral ecological models in which you appreciate that human families vary for a variety of factors, including, say, subsistence mode in pastoralists. Generally speaking, men provide less direct care than, say, hunter-gatherer societies. But it's just to say tons and tons of variation, contingent on a variety of factors, all of which warrant due attention in and of themselves. Something else I'll come back to, paternity as well. There's Tim Bergen. I believe he was one of the advisors to Nick Borton-Jones, recently retired. So the intellectual family continues here at UCLA too. But he has one more Nobel Prize than I think all of us in this room for his work in ethology, in which he recognized, and I think most, if not all of you, are familiar with this, there are 4 approaches to any why question, and these approaches are complementary. We can talk about hormones as mechanisms involved in social behavior, including within families. We can also talk about evolutionary histories I've just touched on, as well as adaptive aspects. But again, those ultimate and proximate are complementary, not competing with each other. I'm only going to talk about a limited array of hormones as we then open up discussion of the endocrine system. I'll talk a little bit about oxytocin and vasopressin released from the pituitary. I'll talk a little bit about DHEA and androstenedione, androgens released from the adrenal glands, and then from the gonads, estradiol and testosterone. There are other hormones. There isn't time to go into all of them, but this will guide some of the discussion today, focusing on those key hormones and how they're involved in aspects of changing human families. All hormones, including, say, testosterone, are pleiotropic, meaning they have multiple effects. Furthermore, they're integrational. In other words, testosterone can promote mating effort writ large by, among other things, promoting spermatogenesis, by promoting sexual behavior, by promoting aggressive behavior in reproductive context, but there may be trade-offs because some of those same effects may come at expense to, say, longevity, for example. But any hormone like testosterone can be pleiotropic, again, multiple effects, but often those effects make sense when packaged together rather than going off in 12 different directions. That's true of every hormone. Vasopressin, I'm not going to say this is the greatest model, this is dated, but the best such integrative models draw upon both non-human and human research. Furthermore, the best models integrate the mood and cognition research as well as the behavioral research to have the most, I think, convincing conceptual frameworks guiding how we think these hormones are related to behavior. Same thing with oxytocin, something we'll come back to momentarily. So now shifting to human families, again, let's think about hunter-gatherer families first and then ask how, again, these compare with variable human families around the world. So you're looking at a picture of some rock art I took last summer in Platfontein, South Africa. Do those look familiar? Any guesses? Trance dancing, anyone? Anyone tried that? If you stay up all night and read Nick Borton-Jones' recent demography of the Hadza, or a terrific book on childhood that includes a lot of hunter-gatherer insight edited by Alyssa Crittenden and Courtney Meehan, terrific insights. It's entrancing. If you stay up all night reading these things, you don't even have to dance, but you will get tremendous value in the latest, I think, of excellent synthetic insights into human families in hunter-gatherer society. As Barry Hewlett shows, in hunter-gatherer societies, on average, adults tend to have about 5 kids, can see that in the left columns, TFR, total fertility rate. So about 5 kids. And other data on survival suggest about half of those will reach adolescence. So imagine you're having 5 kids, 2 or 3 may reach adulthood. I have 2 kids, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But one of the key aspects of how families are changing is just with respect to fertility itself, as well as other aspects of fertility scheduling. So if you look at, say, MAM, which is mean age of menarche or first menstruation, mean age of first birth, MAFB in female hunter-gatherers, MALB, mean age of last birth in female hunter-gatherers, you can see that in these hunter-gatherer data, women are on average having their first kid around 20, and then by mid to late 30s, they're done. And again, within that time, maybe you're having 5 kids, of which 2 or 3 survive. Most female reproductive years are spent in a state of pregnancy or lactational amenorrhea, not cycling. So there's a terrific body of research, and this was huge at HBES last week, including Marty Hazelton gave a plenary, and I'm sure all of you know Marty, given her role on campus, on cycle-related shifts in all kinds of sexual phenotypes. But it's just to remind ourselves that in hunter-gatherer societies or other natural fertility populations, here are data among the Dogon from Bev Strassman. They are not hunter-gatherers, they're pastoralists in West Africa. But note that for women aged 20 to 34, they spend a very small percentage of their lives cycling. What are they doing instead? They're pregnant or in a state of amenorrhea. In other words, they've had a baby, they're nursing, and they're not cycling. So from an evolutionary normative perspective, thinking about hormones and female reproductive cycles, we ought to be thinking about pregnancy and lactational amenorrhea in addition to cycling. But it's missing a mark if we don't think arguably first and foremost about this. And then again, fertility is dropping in much of the world. More and more human populations are having fewer and fewer kids. I think about a quarter of the countries on this planet are now below replacement. I've also done work in several Caribbean islands, including St. Kitts, several summers ago in St. Kitts, where average fertility there is about 1.8 kids per woman now, so it's below replacement. And indeed, people are leaving and they're having fewer babies. It's expensive. So some of the same reasons you might have as grad students in delaying reproduction arguably can apply other places where things like formal education are part of the pathway to adult success. Now, what does that have to do with hormones? There's a functional endocrinology of pregnancy and lactation. So we could talk about the role of a hormone like progesterone that Dan's done some really cool adaptive thinking about, both in terms of cycle-related shifts, but also in terms of what is progesterone doing? It's literally protecting gestation. It's helping prepare the uterus to gestate successfully that fetus to birth and thereafter. Hormones like prolactin aiding and supporting lactation. And then with respect to oxytocin, it, like other hormones, again plays this pleiotropic integrative role, facilitating all kinds of outcomes that make sense in terms of enhancing the success of the offspring. So for any mammal, what's going to be the key to success? Having a mom that cares for you. And oxytocin fosters that through maternal attachment. And what we'd guess is that the original context for oxytocin and social behavior in mammals draws upon maternal infant attachment and then has been co-opted into other relationships, including pair bonds and paternal care, and perhaps even how you care for your beloved dog, something we'll come back to. Just to illustrate the kinds of studies informing those generalizations, Jennifer Hahn Holbrook, as well as others, have contributed to that literature that I'm just alluding to in a couple slides here, but Ruth Feldman's group in Israel has done some of the best studies, and they've done tons of them. And this is one of the first showing that mother's blood oxytocin levels was positively related to multiple measures of maternal behavior. The nursing, as shown there with BF for breastfeeding, increases oxytocin, as you can see here, whereas holding, HD, did not, whereas some other research suggests even contact may be sufficient to increase oxytocin, but that was not the case in this particular study. But several studies also suggest that breastfeeding may attenuate HPA responses to stressors. And this, I think, segues into a life history trade-off of, should I invest in this current or future offspring? These are competing agendas. Put another way, mothering or mating. So there's less endocrine support for sex during a state of lactational amenorrhea when estrogens and testosterone are lower. If you're also having less sex and fewer orgasms, you may also have less of that perhaps reinforcing response of oxytocin with orgasm. The two naturalistic stimuli that will most increase your oxytocin levels, nursing or orgasm. So if you have less sex, including orgasm, you get less of that as well. But again, I think you can think of female hormones and life history within this sort of reproductive life history trade-off of current versus future reproduction. If you're spending more time parenting your offspring, maybe there's less time for that relationship with the partner with whom you've had that offspring. And that would be consistent with meta-analysis of marital quality decreasing when you have kids, especially among mothers. This is a lot of work. And this shows up in some longitudinal studies too, as I'm showing here from Portugal, where there's both decrease in positive behaviors within couples and an increase in negative measures within couples. And I think in terms of this kind of discussion, I think, Brooke, this would be the kind of stuff that needs more behavioral ecological variation to look at this stuff, because as of now, almost all the evidence is from Western societies or China. But within small-scale societies, we don't know if this would show up when you've got other caregivers, and so you're less reliant on a single partner, for example. Sexual behavior shifts with late pregnancy and early postpartum. That's what you're seeing with these data from demographic and health surveys from a variety of countries, including Peru, Philippines, and so forth. The peaks are coital frequency of married women during reproductive ages when they're cycling, and earlier in pregnancy, and then the troughs are later in pregnancy and after you've had a baby. And again, these are whopping fluctuations in sexual behavior. And this is tied to, conceptually, again, the importance of pregnancy and lactation for thinking of sort of normative reproductive behavior and the hormones related to it and so forth. Former PhD student, Michelle Escasador, now at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, did her dissertation research on postpartum women's sexuality in Manila, Philippines. And she showed that using the FSFI, the Female Sexual Function Inventory, which is the gold standard inventory for assessing female sexual function, that there were lower scores on this among women who were breastfeeding but not cycling compared to, these are cross-sectional data, breastfeeding but cycling women. And the breastfeeding non-cycling women also had lower scores than control women who were regularly cycling. I also had some recent discussions with Kat Valentine, who was talking about sort of dating and mating and so forth in Singapore. There also are some interesting things happening in terms of the single non-mother controls who are less sexually active, I think, than some of our US college sample singles samples for which we compare then the partnered individuals or parents, something else to bear in mind. But Michelle also measured estradiol and testosterone in her mothers and found neither of those hormones was related to FSFI score. The best predictor for FSFI score was just how old is your youngest kid that you're breastfeeding. So that trumped the hormone itself. The largest quantitative study of fatherhood and sexuality, here there are no hormones, that anyone's done, to my knowledge, is work my pediatrician colleague Maureen Sams-Vaughan and I did in Jamaica. So as you can see, this has some 3,400 fathers of newborns who reported literally at the time their latest was being born. And what did we find? About a quarter of men did not answer about recent sexual activity, but of those who did, almost half reported no sexual behavior, no sexual intercourse the last week. Asking about sexual satisfaction, 87% said they were mostly or very satisfied. So even though a lot of them were not having sex, they seem to contextualize it within, well, should you expect to be having sex when you just had a baby born? Maybe your mind's elsewhere. But if you still take a step back from this, during the reproductive years, this is a time, I think, when you maximize sexual conflict over sexual desire, late pregnancy and early postpartum. And that warrants attention in and of itself, I think. Sex drive was more variable than other components of sexual function. That makes sense too. These are relatively young men, so you wouldn't expect erectile dysfunction among the relatively young male sample at this point. But also note that about 30% of men reported 2 or more partners the last month. So Brooke, you and I were talking a little bit about this. And so this is relatively high. The only other ethnographic comparison I could find comparable to this that was looking at fatherhood and sex was in Nigeria. Your work would factor right into these discussions, however. And I'll come back to Jamaica a little bit more on some testosterone stuff too. One other last bit, the way to read this is you actually get higher relationship quality. So the scores here, going down with these scores means higher relationship quality associated with higher sexual satisfaction. So one of the best predictors of sexual satisfaction is being in higher quality relationships within the sample of Jamaican fathers of newborns. Now, what if you become a parent but you're not married? So the scant literature that's been done on sexuality and parenting focuses on partnered parents. What though if you are a single parent? So to help get some traction on this, I collaborated with Justin Garcia, Ben Crozier, and several other colleagues using a demographically representative sample of singles in the US, the Singles in America sample. And Match.com basically pays for these studies to be done to help guide their practice, but it opens up terrific opportunities for utilizing massive data sets to try to get rich profiles of single every adult thing in the US. By one way of thinking, you might expect, as I was thinking, if you're a single parent of a young kid, most of your reproductive effort will be spent on parenting effort. Your hands are tied, you're busy. Who has time to mate or date? A different way to look at it, though, is if you're a single parent of a young kid, you wish you had support to help raise that kid and to help with resources for you and that child. So which of these models seem to better apply with the measures here? The latter. So we found that single parents of young kids showed some evidence of elevated, not decreased mating effort compared with single parents of older kids or single non-parents. And there were no decreases in mating effort. So again, it looks like, if anything, you got single parents who are more out there looking rather than retracting in their reproductive effort, just focusing on parenting. That doesn't seem to be the case. In terms of other intersections with hormones, we can't do more than scratch the surface of this, but this is really provocative if you think about it. C-sections versus vaginal births can alter oxytocin pulse characteristics, and could that in turn be related to any maternal offspring interactions in early days? Sue Carter, now director of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana, is doing work on a synthetic version of oxytocin-pitocin to ask about how that is possibly related to child development and maternal behavior. Again, these are the kinds of endocrine interventions that happen regularly in US and other hospitals around the world, but with which we have little sense of how they may or may not be impacting social behaviors within families subsequently. Also think of the variation in lactation patterns, duration patterns, and so forth, and how with the oxytocin and prolactin related to lactation, that too could impact all kinds of other family relationship variables, including within partners, caregiving, and so forth. And one other little tidbit, Jane Lancaster and Hilly Kaplan in a book chapter pointed out that in an evolutionary context, an interesting way to think about female mate preferences is during lactation. So most of us were probably conceived at a time when our mothers were nursing, not when they were wandering amok on a college college campus, not having had a kid and cycling. And that's worth thinking about. That's a different endocrine milieu. If you're thinking about hormones of lactation, as you begin cycling again and then have a baby, and you've already perhaps got other babies in the hand and you're busy and life trade-offs, it's a different sort of mixture from thinking about a lot of the Psych literature on human mating psychology that emphasizes grad students. Or I'm sorry, not grad students, undergrad students on college samples. But writ large, how would life be if all of you had babies in this room right now? Nursing, caring for them, social anxiety, would that look less, more? I don't know, think about that. We live in a wildly different social world in terms of our family lives today, including right now, than our hunter-gatherer forebears. Okay, I'm going to shift from moms to dads. I'm going to only touch on a few highlights in this literature. It's voluminous. So when I first came back to give a talk in 2003, I could summarize everything in one Beck talk. I no longer can. So I'm just going to touch on a few things. And frankly, most of you, from my own experience, will find this relatively dull compared to the dogs that are waiting after the dads. So within life history theorizing, we think that testosterone may both reflect and modulate male allocation to mating and parenting effort. What's the evidence? The one and only published study on human hunter-gatherers is on the Hadza. Martin Muller and colleagues did this some years ago. And they showed among the Hadza, but unlike the Datok living in the same northern Tanzania ecology, but the Datok are pastoralists, among the Hadza, fathers had declining testosterone across the day when they were living with their kids, unlike the Datok. There are now 5 studies on testosterone and polygyny. I did the first for part of my PhD research in Lamu, Kenya. Though hard to see, in both mornings and afternoons, men with 2 wives had higher testosterone levels than other men in the sample. And the latest was just published on the Gambia. Sears and, yes, Lawson. If you're interested in the latest and greatest on testosterone and human polygynous marriage, just out in Adaptive Human Behavior and Physiology. So work continues on this, albeit in a world in which polygynous marriage is declining generally. The first published study showing that outside of North America, fathers had lower testosterone than non-fathers, albeit with cross-sectional data led by Jeff Yang, who I had as an undergrad in Harvard when I was a grad student. There he is. He's now a thoracic surgeon at Duke. So he's left anthropology and social science behind, but he does good stuff. And maybe he'll save our lives someday. But at least he'll do so knowing something about testosterone and family relationships. Lee Getler, I'm sure all of you are familiar with, he basically now has been passed the baton of the best hormones and fatherhood research. So the gold standard for the latest in these studies draws upon the Cebu City longitudinal study that he, Chris Kazawa, and others involved in. And what is so important about this is you have large samples showing also convincingly and causally that in this case becoming a father decreases your testosterone, particularly father of a really young kid. But again, if you're sampling guys across time, you can see that becoming a father decreases testosterone, rather in a cross-sectional study where you don't know how the causal arrow points, even though other evidence would suggest it was both ways. I summarized with Ben Campbell this literature in 2009. There's lots of evidence supporting now, I think, variation in male testosterone, reflecting variation in male reproductive effort within family relationships. And a lot of stuff's been published since that, again, I'm not going to do more than just scratch the surface of. As far as a few summary comments on this literature, just note that you all are familiar with the weird critique of social science literature. That does not apply to this literature, I think in part because many of us are anthropologists who've been behind this. This is a very global research. There are certainly European, Canadian, and American college samples, but there are also tons of samples from every ecology imaginable at this stage. So this is really cool, I think, in terms of that weird critique in which it doesn't apply. We've also moved well beyond just looking at, say, whether fathers have lower testosterone than non-fathers, a categorical distinction, to emphasize the individual variables like relationship commitment, something I'll come back to in a moment. But still note that we still have no testosterone interventions. No one's yet given me testosterone as a father and asked if I treat my kids differently. That has not been done. Even though I did a postdoc in a medical world with one of the leading andrologists, and this stuff is floating out there. Someday that stuff will seep in, but it still hasn't. Yeah, so he could, yes. Who's in Canada, and he's doing currently testosterone interventions. I don't know if he's actually doing that, though, but a good point that I could drop him a line to ask. Moving beyond testosterone, what about other hormones? So whereas, again, we think that oxytocin probably got started in mammals related to mothering, although you can debate whether or not intercourse was also a competing social context in its evolutionary roots. It's been co-opted nonetheless, and here you can see blood oxytocin levels increasing in new or higher in new lovers compared to singles. Many of these studies have given oxytocin through intranasal sprays. Have any of you done that?
You mean conducted a study or?
Yeah. Conducted a study?
Yes and no.
Okay. So we reached, so some years ago I'd give a talk here, and you dream of this kind of stuff, but nowadays there's quite a bit that's done just this. This is the first, to my knowledge, within a partnership dynamic in a lab in which men, but not women, it turned out, show different valences in the positive relative to negative interactions in that lab setting where they induced couples to talk about sort of strife, which is often economics or sex. And The men given oxytocin rather than placebo relatively weighted more towards the positive exchanges within that standardized interaction. What about oxytocin and fathering? So again, Ruth Feldman's group in Israel done lots of good stuff on this, and among other things, blood oxytocin levels in fathers is positive related to affect synchrony. So the degree to which fathers are kind of mirroring the affect or emotional displays of their young children. This was during a home setting. Vasopressin, probably the study you're most familiar with, based on, I think, a Swedish sample, and it's here focusing on the vasopressin receptor and its variants rather than the vasopressin hormone directly. And in a nutshell, this was showing that you find differences in the vasopressin receptor with respect to partner bonding scales or relationship status, like whether you're married or cohabiting, for example. But I will just also underscore, these are small effects. If we genotyped all of you in this room, I could not predict which of you next week will be partnered or not, or your partner bonding scores. So on one hand, it's cool, and this echoes, we're listening to you, Vol researchers. We're listening, but we're still got a long way to go, I think, to do more integrative stuff, including especially on vasopressin and male social behavior. And then one of the latest studies, here you're getting fathers, Jim Rilling and his group at Emory, giving fathers vasopressin or oxytocin, intranasal sprays, or placebo, and you can show things, in this case, effects related to oxytocin, but they had null effects with vasopressin. So this is one of the first intranasal vasopressin studies of fathering, but they found nothing. But then again, you can ask, well, what would you expect if you're in a lab setting? I don't know, I think this is probably more related to maybe a protective response that maybe is harder to induce in a lab setting than it would be more ecologically salient with respect to just viewing photos that induces a different kind of psychology within that lab in the imaging machine. Saying all that, summarizing hormones in male family life, it's huge. I mean, actually, we know quite a bit. So I think anymore, you really have to ask yourself, should we be doing, what more should we be doing? And you need to be really strategic if you're trying to find a further inroad into this. Furthermore, note how we could still use, in that vein, some more experimental field studies. Also note that distinction between baseline and reactive research design, something I'll come back to. But again, we know quite a bit, whereas when I was a grad student, that was not the case. This literature is expanded tremendously. I'll share a few slides now of my latest contribution with Maureen once again on this topic in Jamaica, and a classic work in ethnography helping anchor some of the ways in which we think of variable fathering roles in Jamaica as well as other parts of the Caribbean writ large. My Mother Who Fathered Me, this book goes back some 60, 70 years, with the idea that if you're raised by a single mom, she may be playing the role of a father in addition to mother. You can ask whether that's a really good analogy or not, but nonetheless, that helps in terms of anchoring quite a broad body of scholarship now on this. So you got high prevalence of matrifocal households. This seems to be subject to socioeconomic variation. In other words, the better educated and wealthier families tend to have more stable relationships, more often married and so forth. But for more fluid families, there is also a salient role of stepfathers, which is partly why we then wanted to test whether stepfathers would have higher testosterone levels than genetic fathers. This is an ethnographically salient context in which to test this. It has not been done yet. So this is arguably one of those few niches that are out there that still warrants investigation. We also looked at partnership dynamics, so it's kind of an individual variable rather than a categorical difference, all within a relatively large sample of fathers of young kids. So these are all fathers of 18 to 24-month-old kids, which is a pretty narrow life history. We don't have fathers of old kids. We don't have non-fathers. They're all fathers of 18 to 24-month-olds. So again, a large sample, but sadly, tears. How many stepfathers did we recruit? 6. Boo-hoo. Thus, we could not test the driving motivation for this study. And this was because I think we asked women and men to come to a central facility, and unless you were a male in a highly, in a really invested relationship, you were less motivated to want to come to that central facility. So sad, and I think this is a case where you probably have to go out to households, but that is much more expensive and time-consuming to do that. But sadly, that's where we're left. So with a weaker test of this, we did not find differences in testosterone among men who live with versus don't live with a partner's kids. but as of yet, this thus remains open to still testing. Fathers' relationship quality is inversely related to their testosterone. Why does that matter? Well, first, there's the scatter plot. So once again, these are weak relationships. I could not predict, you couldn't predict my relationship quality if you sample my salivary testosterone. It's still pretty noisy, even though it's significant. But for a father of a young kid, the nature of your relationship with the child's mother helps govern your access to that child. So in this way, paternal care, especially of young kids, is triadic. It's not just a mom-offspring dyad. There's always a contingency of fathering in relation to how you get along with the child's mother. And so that's a reason to look at partnership quality in such a study, in addition to fathering measures that we found no effects related to testosterone. Last tidbit on hormones and fatherhood. What about sexuality? The first study Lee Gettler and colleagues did looking at across time. So the men who became fathers, their testosterone dropped longitudinally less the more often they had sex. So in other words, if you're looking at fatherhood, sexuality, and testosterone, this is the first published study on that. You could take work that David Putz and colleagues have done on college samples in which there's some really cool, complicated stuff happening between testosterone and sexuality, whereby you might find, as they found in several university samples, partnered men had lower testosterone. But interestingly, the more partners you had, that was associated with lower testosterone versus a more open sociosexual psychology associated with higher testosterone. These things compete and thus could mask some null effect, let's say. So I thought, well, let's see if we find something like this in our sample of Jamaican fathers, and we found nothing. So in the second published study now, looking at testosterone and sexuality in fathers, we found nothing. And we beat the data every day, every way you possibly could. Okay, done. Dads, we're done. Dan, we can go get your dogs. It's time. Who needs kids anyway? How many of you use bark boxes? Okay, we got one. I'm not being sponsored by them, but the pet products industry, especially for dogs, has exploded and will continue exploding. It was recession-proof. The most popular class I teach, started today, it's an online summer class, is on the anthropology of animals. Students go wild over this stuff in the way they just don't care about dads. And I'm sure a few of them they've heard me say this before, but it's true. But at any rate, this is part and parcel, arguably, of as we're having fewer and fewer kids, maybe for younger couples, maybe it's not the time and place yet to have a kid. Maybe you have a pet that you raise like one and you push it around in a stroller. Or empty nesters like my parents who have a dog that they treat better than I was treated when I was a young child. Because what else are they going to do? They're retired, they got time on their hands, they see the grandkids sometimes, but a beloved dog will sit kindly next to them on the couch and won't talk back or ask for too many resources. How deep in time does this relationship go? It's debated. At least 12,000 years, maybe back to as long as 30 to 40,000 years. In southern France, in a cave, you can see footprints of what's thought to be a juvenile boy, about 9 or 10, next to what are either prints of a wolf or an incipient dog. Now, who thinks the wolf ate the boy? A couple of you. Who thinks the boy patted the dog on the head? Okay, a few of you too. Well, I don't know.
Who thinks the boy ate the dog?
Who thinks the boy? Yeah, we got another option here. So whatever's happening, something's happening, and it's kind of cool and fun to think about. But back to having footprints, and now with genetic data and archaeological samples, there's a rich story unfolding regarding human-dog relationships that is, the longest-standing domesticated animal there is the dog. A rich, rich story, however it may have begotten. But a world in which we may care for our beloved dogs, putting lots and lots of care into them, lots of money and time and so forth, doesn't, as all of you know who've traveled or work in other field sites around the world where dogs are starved, kicked, and beaten and so forth. No, this doesn't generalize. And it's just to say we can formalize that as former PhD Sharon Young and I did in this EHRAF review of human-pet dynamics, in which indeed there's little parallel to the beloved dog that in our household we have two. And our kids treat them like fur babies. Like the younger siblings they don't have, they treat them that way. But that has little bearing in the wider ethnographic scope. I'm working with a psychology professor in Bangalore, India, to ask about student attitudes towards both pet and feral dogs. So in 7 years, I'll let you know what we find on that as well. Maybe dogs even help you find a partner in the first place. So with Justin Garcia and colleagues, we published this using Match.com members with pets in their profile. 2 findings came out of this, but all within the package by which you may actually look to how someone's treating a dog, including in a photo, to gain some insight in a world that's anonymous, filled with anonymous dating partners. How do I know someone's nice? How do I know that, anyone recognize him?
It's Tom Hardy.
Tom Hardy, yes. So we got all kinds of media publicity in the wake of this, including some publicity out of the UK that stole an Instagram photo of Tom Hardy interacting with his dog. He was in the last Mad Max film, said like 7 words and grunted a lot. But you know he's a nice guy because he's being nice to his dog. You can gain some insight to his personality or social behavioral leanings because he's got a nice dog in his profile. Anyway, two patterns that came out of this. Women were more discerning of a partner than men were regarding associations with pets. Furthermore, dogs serve as stronger social tools than cats in the dating arena. In case you wonder if you can like advertise your cat and get more mates, that'll be less successful, guys. If you want to take a cat and walk around the quad, you'll have fewer Friday night dates lined up afterwards. Okay, shifting from that stuff to hormones in dogs, what do we know? The first study published on human interactions with dogs. These are about 12 to 15-minute interactions, a small sample of 18 South African humans interacting with warmly with dogs, rubbing their bellies and such. And among other findings, the oxytocin measured in blood went up both in the humans and the dogs during this study. So this is the first such published study on human hormone interactions with dogs. This research continues to expand. There have been several other correlational studies, including at Colorado State University, where several scholars showed that at the end of a workday, in a 25-minute interaction measuring blood oxytocin levels just before men and women walk in the door to interact with their dog the next 25 minutes, the women, but not men, showed increases in oxytocin at the end of that long workday. If you don't have a baby waiting for you, have a friendly dog wagging its tail at you. That may warm your oxytocin's heart. What if you give dogs oxytocin? So several, in Japan, several awesome research studies doing just this. And in this particular study, they show in this PNAS paper that dogs given oxytocin versus placebo affiliate more with their dog companions as well as with people, their dog owners. So these are familiars in both cases, but both social affiliation increased with oxytocin versus saline nasal spray. Dogs gazing longingly, long-gaze dogs, at their human dog or human owners induced oxytocin increases in the humans, unlike the short-gaze dogs or the wolves in a 30-minute interaction. Then they gave the dogs either oxytocin or saline spray, and the female dogs, this didn't apply to the male dogs, the female dogs given oxytocin induced oxytocin increases in the human owners. And then that seemed to cycle back to increases in the oxytocin levels of the dogs again too. So that's kind of where we are with the human oxytocin in dog literature. Gaze, intimate relationships. But again, these are cases where, again, these are beloved dogs, I think. We don't have the equivalent of the non-weird dogs. We don't have the dogs that are kicked and beaten in these studies. And so on one hand, this is awesome, but we also need, in terms of integrative social science, to see the other stuff. Paul Zach, I think, used to occasionally come, or his students come to Beck. I don't know if any of his students still come or not, but he's done some oxytocin work, including the only published study on interactions with cats. Now, this does differ, though, insofar as these are unfamiliar dogs and cats. So imagine you have undergrads show up, and they interact with a dog or cat for 10 minutes, but again, it's not the dog or cat you own or live with. So these are unfamiliar. So in both cases, oxytocin went down for interactions with dogs or cats, but especially it looked like with cats. Furthermore, the more cats you'd had, the more your oxytocin went down. So of course, it looks like cats suck the oxytocin out of you. But if you had your beloved cat that you like stroking or likes to be stroked and marked you and your legs and stuff, you could probably induce different effects. But at any rate, then you might ask about other creatures. What if you pet, anyone have like a fish in your aquarium? Dig them out and like see what you can induce. Okay, goodbye dogs and cats. Now on to childhood, back to our nostalgic early years. We again have extended childhoods compared to other apes. We know that. The dental development literature is very clear on that. Furthermore, the pattern of a human extended childhood literally evolved with modern humans. We know that earlier Homo, for example, had shorter developments than we do, even if they were slightly prolonged from other apes. Again, cool stuff, which goes back to the mosaic evolution of hominin life history and its relevance for social life. What does that have to do with hormones? Adrenarchy. So adrenarchy is the rise in adrenal androgens, and it precedes the ovaries or testes secreting steroids. So the adrenals come online, releasing DHEA or androstenedione, and these hormones may have other effects that precede puberty in ways that may also have relevance to sex-differentiated social behavior in mid to late childhood. This has not attracted as much attention as it warrants, however. How has childhood looked today from our hunter-gatherer past? We have fewer kids. Again, our two kids interact with each other, but then they also interact with the dogs because they don't have more younger kids with whom to interact. They also spend an inordinate amount of time in formal education. We just take that for granted for now, but in hunter-gatherer societies, learning seems to take place within mixed age-sex groups. That other Peter Gray, I hope all of you are familiar with him. I'm a little younger than him, but sometimes I'm confused with him or vice versa. He's written tons on this, freedom to learn, for example, but talking about learning within hunter-gatherer context and how that differs from, say, formalized education in US schools. Increased sedentism and so forth. Furthermore, we do weird things like, as parents, shuttle our kids from one athletic activity to the next. We structure their competitive activities. Time for soccer, time for gymnastics, in a way that in hunter-gatherer societies they wouldn't, which segues into thinking about hormones and competition. There's a huge literature in adults on hormones and competition, several meta-analyses. Most of you are probably familiar with John Archer's from 2006, a more recent one from last year, Justin Carre, one of the co-authors on it, looking at testosterone responses to adult competition, both in lab and non-lab contexts. Again, voluminous literature. I'll just allude to it and extend it with one other allusion here. What does video gaming or a relabeling of this as electronic sports or esports have to do with this discussion? Well, if you're delaying, you could say, the onset of adult landmarks. Maybe it's not time to form a long-term partnership. You're still kind of finding your social niche. You're not ready to have kids. Maybe you spend time doing things like video gaming or in esports, in other words. When I was young, I played Atari, and then I grew out of it. Nowadays, this is extending into later ages, including early adulthood. So mindful of that, at UNLV, we recruited some students to test hormone responses to playing League of Legends, which is the most popular esport globally. You could also say, is this good or bad? So Philip Zimbardo, if you know him, the Stanford Prison Experiment, in a book called The Demise of Guys, and an often watched TED Talk of the same title, he thinks this is bad. Young men are spending too much time obsessed with porn and video games. They ought to be doing something more productive. Whereas in Peeps magazine, commenting on young Chinese men in cities, this is a good thing. You're solidifying your social bonds by playing video games in a different social ecology. Anyway, what did we find? Tim McHale over here, also involved in this study. What did we find in this study of 26 esports players from the UNLV Esports Club? Basically no findings. There were no changes in salivary testosterone, cortisol, DHEA, or androstenedione playing either against other people, 5-on-5, or against AI, which is the control condition, although aldosterone decreased. That said, the longer you played against other people, the more your testosterone, DHEA, and androstenedione went up. So I think two things that happening here for our general null findings. One is you're playing familiar foes in a familiar environment. And the other thing is these are relatively short matches, 17 to 26 minutes. It's not quite enough time to see more of those changes take place that are probably going to show up if you had them play longer durations. So back to childhood hormones and competition. All of that literature again on adults. What happens if you test hormone responses of boys playing sports like soccer? And Tim McHale, who's here, so he's a PhD student of mine. He's writing up his dissertation here in Hollywood over the summer, back from his fall 2016 research in Hong Kong. But help laying the groundwork even for that is Tim showed that in Las Vegas elite soccer players, these are boys aged 8 to 10 years of age, DHEA levels and androstenedione levels went up. These are, again, adrenal androgens, but testosterone levels were below assay sensitivity in all but a few cases. What does this mean? This huge literature on adult hormones and competition, it's different, folks, in kids. Furthermore, it looks like it's different in a way that's tapping adrenal androgens, as you'd expect with adrenarchy, doing these weird things like not playing in mixed age-sex groups, but competing in these really intense coalitional competitions. Tim extended this work from Las Vegas to Hong Kong, showing that very similarly, testosterone below assay sensitivity in boys aged 8 to 11, but the action is with DHEA and androstenedione. So this is cool. We're at the dawn of, just like in 1980 and 81, the first studies on adult testosterone and competition were published. 2015 and 17, we hope, right, Tim, will be the dawn of this juvenile hormones and competition literature that in 35 years will look huge. But it's the dawn of another life history era. I'm thinking about hormones and competition. And Tim will also be analyzing shortly results of boys and girls competing in a math competition. So again, this is weird with respect to learning in hunter-gatherer lifestyles, and yet it's unavoidable in most social ecologies for juveniles today around the world. So what happens when boys are competing, and also an interesting bit of this, boys and girls competing against each other too. Ask Tim in the near future. And back to why DHEA and androstenedione? If we drew inspiration from the avian literature, like so many of us did with the challenge hypothesis, in which in non-breeding seasons in song sparrows, it's DHEA, not testosterone, it's DHEA that's related to male-male competition, seemingly through its conversion to testosterone or estradiol, which in turn invites questions about whether 9-year-olds' increases in DHEA and androstenedione, could those be converted to testosterone or estradiol, but perhaps testosterone, to be exerting some central effects that aren't showing up in peripheral measures? We don't know, but speculatively, it's kind of interesting to think about this stuff, and Tim's been rooting around. It's hard to find stuff like, even the age-related patterning of androgen receptor expression in boys, for example. But we would need to know more about that. At any rate, a few tidbits on hormones and competition in kids. Now to aging. Putting it simply, as we live longer, we may invest less in mating effort and invest more in parenting and grandparenting. This is arguably the golden age for studying grandparenting. So David Cole and Ralph Hertwig pointed this out in a 2010 Behavioral and Brain Science Review paper on grandparenting. Why? More and more people are living longer. More and more people have survived. And we haven't yet had that decline in fertility to mean there are less and less grandkids to grandparent, although that's coming. We should be doing more on grandparenting, including hormonal correlates of grandparenting. And arguably a key life history trade-off that has not attracted a lot of attention, Brooke and I were talking a little bit about this earlier, but that warrants more, especially for aging adults, is should you invest more in your ongoing socio-sexual or romantic relationship or in descendant kin? If you don't have enough time for both, should you spend more time caring for a partner or in your grandkids? With respect to the endocrine system, in women, arguably there's reduced endocrine support, particularly with lower estrogens at menopause for sexual function. Furthermore, age-related changes in the oxytocin system that may relate to caring for descendant kin. For men, on average, testosterone, especially free testosterone, tends to decline with age, although there's population variation in the magnitude of that change. And if you're interested in testosterone, male life history, and aging, please read Rick Brebieska's How Men Age that came out recently. He was an undergrad at UCLA some time ago. He's at Yale now, but it's a really fun, quick read on aging, hormones, and male life history, and ties into some of the same conceptual material. Among other things, though, the sex difference in vasopressin tends to attenuate with advancing age. For example, these are urinary vasopressin from a nationally representative U.S. aging and hormone study. And one point to think about then is patterns you see in 25-year-olds may or may not apply to patterns in 65-year-olds. So what happens with sexual behavior with advancing age? There is a large literature on aging and sex. The largest probabilistic demographic samples tend to focus on partnered individuals, however. What happens as you get older? Well, your relationships and their duration also get older. You can't disentangle them easily. So the existing data tell us pretty clearly, as you get older, libido tends to decrease, coital frequency tends to decrease, and so forth. But what happens if you only focus on single adults of a wide age range? That's what Justin Garcia and colleagues and I recently sought to focus on using an R-time sample. So this is kind of a subsidiary of Match.com, but again, these are not R-time members. This is a study they sponsor that yields data that informs what they do, but also gives us wonderful data sets to think about with respect to evolutionary life history. And there are robust decreases in age-related sexual behavior, ideal frequency of sexual behavior, perceived changes in sexual desire, et cetera, in women and men alike. There also are sex differences. Again, most of the literature on human sex differences tends to focus on younger adult ages, but these also show up in aging samples. So sex differences in ideal frequency of sexual behavior, greater perceived change in sexual motivation in women than men, et cetera. To visualize a few of these, you can see women on the top panel, men on the lower panel. A couple measures. Sexual frequency in the last year is the gray. Ideal monthly sexual frequency, the darker color. But you can see, again, both decreasing with age, but also males on both measures higher than females across those wide age profiles. So that gets at some age-related decreases in sexual function, and in turn thinking broadly about mating effort within life history. What about hormones in these discussions? Steroid hormones in women appear to have an influence apart from age, and one of the best ways to try to get some traction on this is looking at the menopausal transition. Moreover, it looks like exogenous estrogen appears to have stronger effects than testosterone. And why is that interesting? Kim Wallen and one of his students have pointed out for a number of years, most of the clinical literature on hormone supplementation in women to look at sexual function features androgens rather than estrogens. And he argues that's misplaced. Jim Roney at UCSB has done, among many others, awesome work on cycle-related changes in sexual function and other phenotypes. And Jim Roney's pointed out it's estrogen that positively and progesterone that negatively predict these phenotypes in young adult samples better than testosterone, convergent with this. In one of the best longitudinal studies from Melbourne, Australia, you can see in menopausal phase 1, this is the first 3 months postmenopausally. Menopause phase 2 is 3 to 12 months postmenopausally. But if you look at things like changes in libido, female libido decreases in longitudinal studies in this menopausal transition. Furthermore, that's best predicted by estrogen rather than DHEAS or testosterone. What about hormones and grandparenting? As of now, we're basically at the pilot data stage. So although Maureen and I published this in a junk journal effectively, all kinds of methodological problems with it. And Mark Flynn in the Caribbean island of Dominica has pilot data unpublished on on urinary oxytocin levels of grandmothers, I think a sample size of 7 interacting with their grandkids. Basically, that's where we are at this point with a need for research on hormones and grandmothering. So Brooke, that's where you could do really cool, groundbreaking stuff in a way that the fatherhood stuff looks relatively saturated by comparison. What did we find in Jamaica? Very little. We did find that grandmothers, so these are women who live with and provide regular care to a young biological grandchild, had higher vasopressin levels than other women who don't live with or provide as much regular care to a grandchild. Those were our controls, basically because we couldn't find non-grandmothers who were within this age range. Moreover, there were no findings, if you looked among the grandmothers, on a day in which they'd provided care the previous 4 hours to a focal grandchild versus a different day. No care the previous 4 hours, still no differences in hormone levels, even though we tested that within subject contrast too. But basically, pilot data is where we're at. What about with men? So again, on a general backdrop of expecting declines in testosterone with advancing age, how does that factor into changing family relationships, testosterone and men? In a longitudinal study just published in Denmark, and here you're collecting data 10 years apart, if you were single then became married, your testosterone level dropped less than if you were married and became single. No, wait. If you were single then became married, think this through for me. If you're single and became married, your testosterone dropped more than if you were married and became single, in which case it dropped less. But again, you can show that in longitudinal work of relatively middle-aged men. Nationally representative U.S. data set showing men who've had kids have lower testosterone than men who have not had kids in older men generally. Also some correlations with overall number of kids. But scratches the surface of thinking about testosterone, male life history, and family relationships. Anyone seen these ads on the internet? Or perhaps on the signs next to the freeway as you're stuck in driving here regularly? I'm not being sponsored to say this stuff, but in Las Vegas you've got Senescence, one of the epicenters of training clinicians to provide anti-aging medicine, of which testosterone is a key component. I work at a coffee shop sometimes across the street from that place. I've yet to walk in, get injected, and walk out, but maybe someday I will. I'll let you know. If you see me look like inflated next time, you'll know that that's where I went. But with first-year grad student Nick Ivanoff, we did this content coding analysis of the home pages of 49 such websites, and half of these are seemingly focused on relatively younger men aged 40 or younger, and then half, 24 of them, to men aged 40 and older. In other words, you can code the age target of the audience, it also looks like. And what do we find? The most frequent contents concern advertising. Well, that's probably not surprising. They're trying to sell a product. But also then ties into discussions of how do you go about doing that. Trust me, I'm wearing a lab coat. I'm sorry I didn't wear a lab coat, then all of you would trust what I had to say more than me wearing this blue shirt. For older men, more of those codes referred to youth, aging, vitality, and longevity than the younger men. And that kind of makes sense. You're looking for the fountain of youth, or at least you're trying to market a product to older men that are looking for a fountain of youth. Apart from advertising, though, the most recurrent themes were muscle and sex. So we all know sex sells, especially to younger men, and muscle also sells, especially to younger men. Which again ties into, I think if we think about life history and aging, younger ages, you're thinking more about mating effort. As you get older, you're just trying to stay alive to help provide some resources to the grandkids. And that even shows up in content coding analyses. So to summarize, human families have and always will change. We mean that in two ways. How do human families compare with our close primate, particularly great ape kin? Much of those changes have occurred in the last few million years of hominin evolution in a mosaic fashion. But since we left Africa as hunter-gatherers, expanding around the world, giving rise to a variety of family structures, that too opens up effectively a wide array of natural experiments and family variation that we can then exploit with respect to trying to understand from a life history perspective, including the role of hormones therein. And hormones both shape and reflect key life history allocations, including to current versus future reproduction, mating versus parenting effort, and then that last partnering versus caregiving that, again, has hardly attracted any attention, but arguably does warrant much more attention, particularly in aging individuals. And that's all I've got for you. Thank you again for having me back. It's a delight to be back here. And I think Susan was looking to see if my honors thesis is up there somewhere. I don't know if it is, but I guarantee you none of you want to read it, so I won't subject you to that either. But thank you again for indulging me. Yes, and I apologize. I just realized I went longer than I should have. So, but here we go.
Okay, I just want to note that I'm just a Thai dad, first of all.
Oh, tied. Now.
Thai dad in terms of anyway, I just wondered, it's interesting, endocrinology of parenting, but do you think it would be different from the endocrinology of parenting, or if so, why?
I think it would be different because, for one reason, the background endocrine milieu, plus the experiences, plus the number of kids you've had, let's say you're a 60-year-old versus a 25-year-old, those are all different. And I think they would all go into shaping the nature of an interaction with a young child. So yes, I do think they'd be different. And
or do you think the hormone levels would be different, but still have similar kinds of effects, or do you think they would sort of have somewhat different effects on behavior at different ages?
yeah, I don't have a good answer to that. I'll just argue from one analogy. So my postdoc mentor, Shally Basine, ran this gold standard of studies. So he was one of the architects of the testosterone and aging study in humans, the 3-year duration one. And incidentally, it took so long to do, I was working on some of that stuff as a postdoc way back when. But they did work in which both with younger men and older men, all given GnRH agonists to effectively chemically castrate them, then given 5 different testosterone replacement doses, but they found that the phenotypic effects differed for younger and older men. So on one hand, they were the same hormone levels against the backdrop of chemically castrating them, but they had different effects in young versus older men, I think for the kinds of reasons just noted. Also think about hormone receptors, how those may look different, and so forth. So that's by way of analogy, but I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Peter. Very stimulating, remarkable breadth of material. I appreciate both all the work that you and your collaborators have done, and also you introducing us to related work done by other people. So I'm just going to pull out one tiny speck from the giant pile of material that you presented, and that's the finding from the Match.com study, where you reported that single parents of younger children reported more mating effort than of older children. You framed the interpretation of that in terms of their seeking additional parenting care by a prospective partner. I think there's a flip side that maybe is compatible with that or maybe not at all. And I'm agnostic as to the adaptive nature of that flip side. So let me give you the flip side and then spell out some of the possibilities. And the flip side is that it is harder, that people recognize empirically, at least in this society, that it's harder to attract a partner when one is the single parent of an older child than the single parent of a younger child. So single parents of younger children may feel the clock is ticking, right? They need to get to work if they're going to find a new partner. And single parents of older children recognize, well, the odds are not that great. So more people opt out of the pool, as it were. Now, why people recognize that? I think empirically, I think they're right. The first question is that a weird society effect? One can imagine that it easily could be, given that adoption of unrelated individuals and phenotypically radically different individuals is fairly common in our society, and of course we're willing to parent the fur babies, right? That is, there seems to be all kinds of functionally misdirected parental investment, right? So one possibility is just a weird effect, right? But another possibility is that that in fact it's only slightly weird in the sense that something like that happens around the world, but that more typically it may be that that is part of some larger strategy, right? So that parenting effort is in fact mating effort on the part of step-parents, right? And that a young stepchild may be more tractable in many ways than an older stepchild, right? The costs of that allocare versus the benefits, the ratio may be more favorable. I don't have an opinion between those. That is the complete misfiring of the mechanism due to radical evolutionary disequilibrium and the other. But in neither case is it clear that single parents of younger children are more active in the mating market because they are explicitly seeking additional care, which was your interpretation.
Yeah, I'm open to that. So I don't feel wed one way or another strongly. So we in good academic prose throw out these as kind of speculations in the discussion section, but I'm by no means wed to one interpretation over another. And instead, I would advocate for just doing more research on this generally, and that could entail testing some of the parameters that you think are most important, but also the societal variation. So like with Brooke, we've had conversations with Courtney Meehan about how ACA women repartnering, that looks probably different from what we're thinking here, and it might be more seamless, and yet, can any of you think of the literature on single mothers' mate preferences in small-scale societies? I can't either. So this is just scratching the surface. I have a master's student who focuses on single mothers' mating preferences in the U.S., but it does not get at these kinds of issues in small-scale societies either. So I'll just leave it at that and just argue that we need more work on this. And it's too early to throw out any interpretation and stick by it rigorously, but instead those are just a couple of ideas, I think, to guide some interpretation thinking within life history context, but by no means is that's the start of a story rather than the end of it.
So I wanted to bring together sort of the work on fathers and the work on grandmothers, because there is this variation that you showed about how strong, or if there is a father effect at all, basically across these societies. And I'm wondering if the level of the father effect has something to do with how important the father's role is compared to other allocare providers. So like if you have societies where grandmothers are really important, are you less that, you're going to not see a father effect in those societies? I don't know. I mean, so that would seem like that would make sense, like in the Jamaica case, for example, where you didn't find a father effect, right?
Well, in the Jamaica data I presented here, just to also be really careful too, that again, that's such a narrow bandwidth of life history variation. Those are fathers of young kids, so we don't have the non-father control there.
But those are where the father effects are strong, like in the gender data, right? That's where you see the effects are the strongest, and then as the kids age, then they kind of renormalize. Right? Yeah, I think it's a good point. So in those data would be buried a potential to link some measure of the grandmothering involvement relative to those fathers' testosterone. I can say, though, in terms of the logistics of working on this, this is a cohort study, which I'm only involved in the fatherhood arm. I don't think it'll ever happen, sadly. Even though the data actually exist. I was thinking more like norms across studies rather than individual. I mean, you might find it at the individual level, but I was also just thinking, where I work, direct care by fathers is really minimal, and it's mostly they even go back and are co-resident with grandmothers after birth. So I would be very surprised to find a father effect in that kind of situation. I was just thinking that might also be true in other.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think Joe had her.
But Brooke asked my question.
Oh, okay. I love that. Great minds think alike. I don't know who's next.
I'm thinking of an environmental tie-in, and I'm thinking about the findings that frogs in the San Joaquin Valley are now showing in their gonads mixed histology and aberrant behavior of the males. Do you know if there are any studies looking at populations that are multi-generational exposure to pesticides and their hormonal levels or fertility rates or?
There is a lot of that work. I actually don't know the literature though, honestly. So I can stop there, but there is a lot of work on that, because people talk about testosterone levels are declining, sperm counts are declining, sperm quality may be declining, but I unfortunately I can't summarize that well.
I really appreciate all the things that you sort of touched on in this huge talk. So kind of correspondingly, I have a really broad kind of thought or question. and my impression is this is true of almost anything in the hormone literatures, which is that you are seduced by wanting to infer causation always, and even in sort of the latter slide where it's like these hormones are shaping these behaviors and so on, and certainly I expect there's bidirectional effects happening, but in terms of getting an empirical picture of cause, short of a handful of administration paradigms and things like that, which are themselves usually limited in that whatever effects you're looking for have to happen within the next hour or two, if that, in a lab setting or somewhere. What do you do? And I'm just curious, given the societal consequences and importance of understanding a lot of these neuroendocrine effects, is there any movement towards, so for example, doing large-scale longitudinal kinds of projects would be one way to, I would think, to get traction on, for example, whether getting divorced is what causes the hormone change, or whether there was a preceding tendency towards the hormone change, which might be predictive of behavioral outcome. And I don't know much about this, but I believe that like countries like Sweden, collect massive samples, including some biomarker data and things like this. But what are your thoughts in general about the correlation causation problem, and are there efforts to address it in a large scale?
Excellent question. So Jim Roney and James Hyam co-edited a special issue of Hormones and Behavior that finally has just appeared. I think all the contributions are finally packaged and now out there. I think I alluded to that too, I think, Susan. Check this out. So again, Hormones and Behavior. One of the contributions Tim, Justin Carre, and I have is a review of human male field studies of hormones and behavioral reproductive effort. And we touch on these very issues. And I think these are trade-offs across methods. We will never be able to go into the HIMBA and give women oxytocin. Well, maybe you will. I don't know. Give women oxytocin or give older men testosterone versus placebo in experimental designs. And even if you can, paralleling the existing studies that do it, they're short durations, and they're not mimicking the endogenous hormone levels in relation to the external stimuli either, even though they're a causal manipulation of a hormone. So then you get these large longitudinal prospective studies like Lee Gettler and colleagues have worked in Cebu City, and Maureen, by the way, she was part of the parallel study in Jamaica, running, it was one of those in the 80s that were created. I think there were 6 of them around the world. So she came out of that same sort of mindset. But the infrastructure and expense are just mind-numbing. But then the kinds of measures that you can have in there in a large study with lots of bureaucracy, you sacrifice the nuance of measures for crude measures that you can say anything about causally. So the causal ability to test whether something about male family change or female family change over time is related to some hormone, the hormone measures and the behavioral measures are often crude. These are methodological trade-offs. And that's how to look at it. So there's always going to be room for the person who'll come along and do the really fine-grained, cool thing. But to do all of them together, that's why we're all standing on the shoulders of giants. We say, I'm glad you guys over in public health are doing this. You in medicine are doing more experimental testosterone manipulations. I'm over here doing these correlational studies and field sites. Let's pull it all together. But we need to have a mindset that says we're willing to pull it all together rather than, I don't need that literature over here, I don't need that literature over here. And then also as far as causal stuff, just sort of fun aside, but what do you guys think the original endocrine intervention was? If you had to think back to deeper history, how did anyone first learn about the power of a hormone? Castration, yeah. So among the REL some years ago, we were trying to say we're studying testosterone and aging. How did we get that point across? Oh, that's what happens when you castrate the animal. Oh, good, I get it. Is a 90-year-old man castrated? But anyway, the point was castration ended up being an ethnographically salient point for the role of testosterone, even in a pastoralist population.
So I want to turn to what I think is inarguably the most important component of your presentation, and that's dogs.
Dogs would agree. That's what I think all of you. Again, I'm a dad. It's Father's Day. Just be nice to your dad on Father's Day, okay? Then go back to caring about your dogs.
So you made the contrast between the fur babies and the village dogs, and pointed out that we know much more about the latter, the former than the latter. And totally apt. I think they're both obvious developmental differences, but they're also probably differences as a consequence of artificial selection, right? Studying golden retrievers now and their oxytocin responses to humans and their ability to elicit oxytocin responses in humans that's an artificial stimulus. We've created this sort of super releaser in a lot of ways, right? But I'm not convinced that village dogs are actually the appropriate point of comparison if you want the deep history of human-dog coevolution. And the reason is because, at least as people typically mean village dog, they mean something like the dog that lives among sedentary agriculturalists and subsists on refuse. And the trouble is, those dogs have sort of one function only, and that's guarding, essentially. It's the only reason people keep them around. Maybe some small, pest control functions, right? Whereas, arguably, for most of the time that humans and dogs have been around, they were partners. So both in hunter-gatherers that use dogs and in pastoralists that use dogs, I would expect the human-dog dynamic to be very different. So both the developmental environment for the dog and arguably the artificial selection acting on the dog is quite different. And so really, if you want what is the stimulus with which humans have co-evolved, it is that much more partnership relationship. Now doesn't mean that people who use dogs in pastoralism push them around in baby carriages. Of course, I
hope not. That'd be
absurd, extreme. But it's not clear to me that, as you put it, the dog that gets kicked all the time is actually the appropriate point of comparison.
Fair point. Fair point. So I think, Brooke, years ago, you and I talked about among the Martu, for example. I mean, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah. Nobody's ever done it to my knowledge. I mean, Jeremy Koster's done all this work on human-dog, the hunting relationship, but not about the emotional connection. But yeah, if somebody wants to do that research, I know exactly where they should go.
Yeah, and that's a good parallel, because these are dingoes, so they are sort of feral, domesticated dogs, but interacting with foragers, in a sense, in which that dynamic may be more salient to these issues. So point well taken. And then I will say one other tidbit, you think about this, is the role of gaze. So which breeds have been selected to maintain gaze with humans? Some of them are the dogs aiding in retrieving the animal you've shot. Maybe it was a bow and arrow in the past, maybe now a gun, but the gaze piece could be one of those interesting components. And if you're looking for, what should we call this? So Sharon Young and I jokingly said, maybe this would be the WOOFs, the Western overfed, overindulged Fidos, like the fidelity that they maintain for the human. But you guys all know, Joe Henrik helped launch the WEIRD acronym. If you guys come up with something better, it's awaiting the comparative dog cognition equivalent label. I think there's one last question.
Time for one more question? Just one more. Okay.
Last one of the year.
Woo! The pressure's on you.
Really special. First of all, thank you for such a fascinating talk. So many points of interest. Love to hear more about it. Coffee or whatever. But I just thought I would ask you about the adrenarchy stuff that you mentioned, because I'm so curious about how adrenarchy functions in this sort of phylogenetic context. The evidence being that it is not present, my understanding is, in other non-human primates, or it doesn't, or at least during that life phase, there doesn't seem to be an equivalent. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts about that, why that is, what is it specifically doing that is unique in life history?
A good question. And so some years ago, I was with Ben Campbell underneath trees in northern Kenya thinking about adrenarchy, and that became part of what was in a 2006 review on this stuff. At the time, it looked like, given the existing data, maybe this was more of a unique driver of human life history. It no longer looks to be the case. If anything, like Sean Prahl, a postdoc here working with Brooke, he's shown convincingly in orangs adrenarchy's there, and it looks like it's at least a grade 8 phenomenon. And then recently we had Robin Bernstein from University of Colorado come and give a talk at UNLV, and she summarized some of the non-ape primate data, suggesting that at least in some macaques there is a short-lived phase of what may be adrenarchy or something similar. So I think the phylogenetic piece has changed over time as more data have come in, and there's less of a human unique story, even though human juvenility still is, of course, unique relative to apes, but probably less so because of adrenarchy. Is there something about apes generally, though, that, in terms of an integrative perspective on these hormones, it may be shaping immune function, stay alive during this period, you're learning a lot, but don't expose yourself to the extreme risks before you actually get to reproductive age. So there's that would tie in some immunomodularity effects as well as some of the perhaps behavioral effects. But I'd say Huckberg and Ben Campbell's integrative stuff, probably the best ways to think about that stuff. But I'll stop my meanderings at that, I guess. Probably enough said.